I know it's really late for me to be saying this, but I think the Pokemon community is broken beyond repair. On the VGC side, it's just like deranged Wolfie fans that don't think he cheats, but if he did, cheating is okay, but he still doesn't cheat. And on the Smogon side, you're not allowed to make valid points about their casual format and broken ban logic. The sad thing is, I just want to have rational conversations about Pokemon with anyone. I love Pokemon that much. Pokemon is the biggest passion in my life. It is why I do all these discussions and all this coverage for my YouTube channel, because I love talking about Pokemon, but it's become impossible to have good conversations about Pokemon with just people in the Pokemon community. And it's made even worse by all the Poketubers and influencers because they're all fake. They don't want to have any real conversations or discussions about Pokemon. They don't have any passion. They just want to cover fake leaks and hack everything. As I've been saying for too many years to remember at this point, I'm the only Poketuber that's trying to make the Pokemon community better. And it's just like sad how toxic it gets and how everything just gets worse and worse and more deranged. But you know, I'm just gonna make videos about my interactions. Maybe enjoy it. If you do, like, comment, share, all that fun YouTube stuff. But it really is crazy that all I do is read things and then apply critical thinking skills, and I can body anyone in the Pokemon community in a discussion, which is also why no one wants to have a conversation with me, because I expose how terrible their ideas are or how they're just wrong and they refuse to admit it. So this was like a reply chain to what was going on with my reaction to the Volcarona ban, and this guy said, I feel like Terra Preview would fix everything. If you know what Terra type they could access, then I feel like it could bring Volcarona and possibly others back, but I'm not too sure. Now, my response is that this is just casual mechanics, because you're dumbing down the game and you're trying to make it easier. And having Terra Preview is a classic Smogon solution of making the game less difficult to coddle their player base. So the response is, what do you think would be a better way to preserve a balanced and fun metagame? And here's where I've actually read things. Well, since the Smogon survey shows that the council's decisions have made the meta less balanced and enjoyable, the way to preserve a balanced and fun metagame is to play it how the devs designed and tested it, and use banning as an extreme tool to stop 90% usage, truly unstoppable strategy that's never existed in Pokemon. And that is kind of like the crazy thing, to where all you have to do is read things, and you're more knowledgeable than the entire Pokemon VGC community, because we just saw that with the Korean ruling. Apparently, I'm the only person in the entirety of the Pokemon community that has read the play Pokemon rules to where I could see that, yeah, match fixing is bad, and it's actually a severe unsporting penalty that requires disqualification. And determining the outcome of a match by random means is in the rules, which is the only thing that could be happening when players are colluding to run Pokemon that only know Metronome for the top 4 matches. And somehow, even though I'm outside of Smogon, I'm the only person that's actually like looked into the data of the polls to find out that I've been right the entire time. So this goes back to April. It appears the entire player base finds the metagame somewhat enjoyable, but there's room for improvement. Both demographics went down slightly, but this was prior to the recent ban. So even with the non-stop banning, the enjoyment of the metagame only goes down in Smogon. Also, side note, for a downtrend, things are going to be worse than the data shows because players are quitting, and that means they're not there to respond to the poll to bring the numbers down because they're quitting because things are so bad. So it's actually worse than this. On a scale of 1 to 10, how competitive and balanced do you find the current metagame? Player base is beginning to view the metagame as slightly less competitive, so it's still going down. Both demographics hit a low point for the generation prior to the Shed Tail ban. So it's bottomed out. Like, the competitiveness, despite all the bans, as of April, was at the lowest point. But don't worry, a Shed Tail ban will fix all of that. And then following the Pokemon Home update, the quick bans of Regieleki and Spectrier, how enjoyable do you find the current metagame? A couple months ago, we were above this by a decent margin. So it still keeps on going down. And then on a scale of 1 to 10, how competitive and balanced do you find the current metagame? And this is like the worst we've ever seen it. So even with quick bans, even with keeping everything that was in Ubers before the Pokemon Home update in Ubers, the game is no more balanced and everyone hates it and finds it less competitive than ever. This is what happens when you create a casual player base that feels entitled to banning everything that they deem is a problem. So when something that they don't think needed a ban gets banned, but the thing that keeps stomping them because they're bad players doesn't get banned, it's only going to lead to less balance and less satisfaction. And I also have the point that the game is designed around exactly not Smogon. For starters, there's an item clause, and Smogon doesn't have an item clause, so that immediately breaks the game right there. It means that more care is going to go into team building, and also the viability of Pokemon is going to shift around, where you can't just throw 3 leftovers on 3 tank Pokemon, 3 scarves on like some bulky sweeping Pokemon, and then say, yep, that's a balanced team build, ready for the ladder. Well, no, that's just going to like break the game. And I do find it interesting that some value does eventually come out of these arguments with unproductive weirdos that, actually, wait a second, maybe the biggest issue with Smogon is that they don't have an item clause where the developers are balancing the entirety of competitive around that item clause. Someone made that point like somewhere else in all of this madness and was like, oh wow, yeah, that's actually like probably a big part of the problem. So I used Smogon's own survey data against this person who has clearly never read it to kind of build up my point even more, but then I also give a critical suggestion, because they say, alright, what do you think is a better way to preserve a balanced and fun metagame? Well, banning everything has made the game less fun, objectively according to the Smogon users, so maybe the core design is just better. But if something must be banned, I think I also stumbled into, like, the best way to save Smogon or make the best competitive Pokemon format, and that's to have a small ban cap of less than the amount of Pokemon that are allowed on a team, because once you start banning 6 or more Pokemon, well then you've just banned counters to counters, and then you're just destabilizing everything. So you have like 4 Pokemon that can be banned at a time, and that means if a flavor of the month becomes problematic, because that's all it is that, oh wait, we've been playing Pokemon for how long, and this generation has been going on for how many years, and then suddenly just like something pops up and needs to be banned in 2 weeks? Oh, that's just flavor of the month. It was either Sleeper strong the whole time, or all the nonsense and lack of game sense in the Smogon community has ignored really good strategy, or they just refuse to find counters, because that's also in the Smogon philosophy. That, again, I'm just the only person that reads things when it comes to Pokemon. I'm reading the data, I'm reading the VGC rules, I'm also reading Smogon's own philosophy, and then going, wow, I can debunk every argument from Smogon with its own philosophy. And the people defending Smogon haven't even read Smogon's own philosophy, where it states, sometimes it is the inclination of players to rebel against the accepted standard for a multitude of reasons. Players find flaws, whether perceived or real, in the state of the OU metagame and attempt to forge their own path and develop their own designs based on their current knowledge. This is so demeaning to players that are actually trying to be creative, that are breaking from the Smogon mold to then improve and become better than them. And that's kind of like the whole thing about Smogon, is that if a Pokemon makes them look bad because their game sense or their idea of how they want to play the game doesn't jive with that Pokemon, it just gets banned, so they stop looking bad when they lose to it. And this is happening even with the recent bans. This guy making the point, somehow things have gotten worse since Finch became the head of the council. You can tell because when he's in important games, he just whines when he loses and then wants to ban those Pokemon, Volcarona as an example. So the head of the OU council is so trash at Pokemon, he gets bodied by Volcarona, and then it gets banned. And that's kind of like where I've been against Smogon since Generation 4, where it's like, wait, you kids can't deal with Garchomp. A Pokemon that's 4 times weak to Ice and in Generation 4 did not have an ability. But because your teams can't handle it, you gotta ban it, and then all the other bans come into play. And when you read this description of OU council members, it's like, wow, that's just like every battle against a Smogon player where you do the thing that you weren't supposed to, where it's like, nuh-uh, I could have predicted you to do that, and then you lose the game on the spot, so you're the bad player for not falling into my prediction, or you're the bad player for running this low-tier trash Pokemon that happens to counter me, but it only counters me, and I only let it counter me because no one plays it unless they're a bad player. Like, that's the entirety of the Smogon mentality summed up, and then you can also kind of see it playing through here, where, like, it's this part. Players find flaws, whether perceived or real. If you find a flaw in the OU metagame, you're just making stuff up. It's not real, because the OU metagame is an attempt at making the best, most flawless Pokemon format, even though all it does is fail at that and just gets worse and worse over time. And also by saying they're trying to forge their own path on their current knowledge. But the knowledge of an individual can be flawed and will be flawed when scrutinized by Smogon. Once in a while, so acknowledging that very rarely, sometimes, this rebellion actually generates something. Once in a while, this results in an effective new design. Other times, merely results in the same standard or one of the standards that was already designed. However, many times, that means you aren't better than Smogon. You aren't better than the council. You don't know better than anyone else because you're just a pleb that isn't following the rules. So many times, it's going to be inferior design, an artifact of ignorance and poor planning. Creativity is ignorance according to Smogon. No wonder they ban everything that makes them look bad. There is no expectation to develop the meta. There is no expectation to find counters and deal with problems. You cry until all the bad things go away, and it's right in the Smogon philosophy. So this is what I mean when I say if a flavor of the month is actually a top 5 most problematic Pokemon, then that means you gotta let something else back in, because apparently that wasn't as much of a threat. I think that actually eventually makes a very balanced and stable metagame, even if it means like maybe there's just some annoying Pokemon people don't want to deal with that actually isn't a threat and is very counterable, but it makes the game feel better. Like you just remove Blissey, and then it's like, oh, now I don't have to worry about bringing a 2 special heavy team and then just getting walled out for no reason, even though Blissey is like a low usage Pokemon. Turns out, one Pokemon countering over 90% of special attackers in the game probably isn't good for game health. But it also means that if there is a special heavy metagame, you just put a Blissey on your team, that's going to patch in a lot of team building, and then that's going to remove the special leanings of the metagame, and then some physical counters for Blissey happen. But Smogon derangement comes through, and then they just ignore everything I said. I gave the suggestion they wanted. What do you think would be a better way to preserve a balanced and fun metagame? And then mine is, hey, you just have a pool of Pokemon that are allowed to be banned, and you have to drop something out of that if you want to put a new thing in. Completely ignores it. Doesn't say why it's wrong, if it's a bad idea. I don't see how a meta where we're required, and this is just another thing where it's like, it's just buzzwords, word soup, and nonsense, and just made up arbitrary definitions of things for Smogon. I've been covering this since like the Aegislash ban, where they just made up a definition of over-centralizing, said, yeah, Aegislash is over-centralizing, and then they like retroactively applied it to some other things, but then in doing so, you could just see like nonstop contradiction in how that's being ruled out. And then if you actually go into like the OU rulings for Generation 8, Generation 9, they'll even say like, oh, while this Pokemon isn't as centralizing as others, or while this Pokemon doesn't over-centralize, we still think it's unhealthy. So they just make things up and then they throw away the definition when it becomes inconvenient. But it's also just the complete lack of game sense to think that you are required to deal with Palafin, which is actually just a dogshit Pokemon since it gives the opponent 2 free turns of advantage. Chien Pao, Chi-Yu, and Fluttermane. So that's 4 of your 6 Pokemon right there. So if people are running that, out of the over 100 viable Pokemon and thousands of potential movesets and strategies they can have, it just comes down to 4 out of 6. And these Pokemon aren't really super threatening anyways. And this also completely ignores what I said. If you think these are the 4 strongest Pokemon that are impossible to deal with, or you should not be required to deal with them, alright, cool. You use your cap of 4 bans on them, game's balanced. Oh, it turns out it isn't, because then we saw player satisfaction keep going down no matter how many bans were thrown on top of the Scarlet and Violet metagame. Your argument is that we should learn to deal. Yes, that's how meta works. But again, there's never been an allowance of meta development in Smogon based on its own philosophy and non-stop bans, so that's what the players expect. Smogon has just trained these people to be NPCs that don't understand anything about anything they're saying, and it's just getting crazier and crazier. So yeah, like, Palafin's terrible, Chi-Yu isn't a problem, Fluttermane dies at any physical hit, you don't need a dedicated counter or requirement to deal with them. And that's the crazy thing about Pokemon. No matter what your team is, you are going to get countered. You are going to get swept by some unsuspecting Pokemon and strategy because that is a vulnerability, and it's likely to happen with like some Pokemon that was seen to be weak, There's so much in the game, you can't plan for everything. But for some reason, Smogon players want to pretend that they can plan for everything. And then they just want to make the game about out-predicting the other person on a Switch prediction, and then that being what decides the game. Which is why they ban everything to where there's only 10 predictable Pokemon and viable movesets, and then they just handshake on everything else because they have to know what the opponent is doing. Any amount of skill to determine what the opponent's strategy could be or finding out a win condition is too much for these casual players, so it must be removed. Which again goes back to the wanting to see the Terra types. Everything has a counter, and if those things are common and problematic, you get free wins playing against them. The players won't like losing to the counters, change the flavor of the week. Oh my god, that's meta development. Exactly. Like, if you want to keep running the same 4 out of 6 or 6 out of 6 super meta Pokemon, and then people just bring hard counter teams because, oh, that's a 60% win rate right there, because 60 to 70% of players are just running these 4 Pokemon, either they're going to get tired of losing, all the teams are going to turn into, like, counter teams, and then, oh wow, that's meta cycling. Huh. So this is your average coddled Smogon NPC, but there was also some other ones that were just like mind-blowing, to where we just have, here's a tragically bad player that uses Smogon as a crutch because they understand nothing about Pokemon, because Smogon players understand nothing about Pokemon because they've banned and removed all the mechanics to where there's just nothing, like, it's just not Pokemon anymore. So we have a reply on Twitter saying, my builds hit so well, taught my cousin the power of Defense Curl Chansey, because yeah, Defense Curl Chansey is outrageously busted. And then we have this person that understands nothing about Pokemon. Surely this is satire. Chansey has 5 defense. That means nothing. Like, and my response is, you really know nothing about Pokemon. And then I know it has a ton of hit points, but it still has 5 defense. They double down on knowing nothing about Pokemon. It's wild. I say, what does 5 defense have to do with anything, considering the move boosts defense quite a lot? Tripling down. A legendary tripling down of ignorance. So I respond, do you know how stats and stat boosts work? I'd like to hope so. Like, the hit point investment helps it out a lot and lets it live a few hits, which is completely wrong. But it still doesn't seem to be very optimal EV spread, even with 252, 252 plus. The Eviolite doesn't save it for 2-hit KOs, even with the +1 defense boost. This is also what I mean when I say that people that refuse to watch my content or are just NPCs that hate on me for no reason are deliberately making themselves worse at Pokemon just out of hate and spite. Because I preach and I talk about how damage interactions work more than anyone else. I stress the win conditions and stuff around it more than any other competitive Pokemon player. It's why I'm the best competitive Pokemon player. Because, like, this is what happens when you just get into the general Pokemon competitive community or Smogon players and people that watch other influencers. They don't understand how Pokemon works. Because look at this, we go from 641 to 704. We are only gaining 10% more hit points by investing half of our usable EVs. Now, yes, going 252 is just going to give you more durability against what you're weak to, but this is the least efficient place you could put your EVs, even compared to special defense, where, whoa, look at that, we're getting 20% more special defense durability. But then defense is the most efficient place to put it, to where we get over double durability in defense. So when you read this, hit point investment helps out a lot. No, it actually helps out the least. And it doesn't seem to be very optimal EVs to get the most stat effectiveness out of putting it into defense. Brain dead. So with the quadruple down, they could not be more wrong about anything else in Pokemon. It's insane. And then I break down the numbers and the math around it. So let's go and pull up those images. So here we have a Pokemon using a physical attack. It has 130 base attack, using a 100 base power stab move with Life Orb. This is a very above average physical hit, and an uninvested Chansey is going to get bodied by it. But we have EVs and stuff, so let's slap on Bold Nature, let's go max defense, and then we can see that even without the hit point investment, I just realized I didn't put hit point investment for these damage calculations. So it's actually better than this, but once you go into the bold Eviolite, remember, those EVs are bad. If you're putting EVs into a Pokemon with a 5 of that stat, you're getting nothing out of them. Wait a second. We just went from a double overkill, like almost 200% of Chansey's health and damage to a 3-hit KO. Also, they said, even with the +1 defense boost. So let's look at that. So here we have just nothing, uninvested into a +1 defense boost. Wait a second, we just knocked off a third of the damage. That it goes from like 200% to 133%. That's because defense boosting is flat. And once again, that's something that is talked about on this channel frequently and has been talked about for a decade. That if you boost your defense by 50%, you reduce damage by a third. That does, having a 5 in your stat doesn't change any of that. That's why I was like, wow, this guy understands nothing about Pokemon. I ask him what this has to do with anything, and then he says, considering the move boosts defense quite a lot. It actually means the opposite of what he thinks it means. So you actually get larger defensive value from boosting lower stats. And then when we bring it all home with this Garchomp damage calculation, bold, Eviolite, max defense EVs, and then we also have the +1 from a defense curl, the Garchomp goes down to a 4-hit KO. Well, actually, the 252 with Eviolite literally saves it from 2-hit KOs by turning those into 3-hit KOs, and then the +1 defense boost just wins and then turns into a 4-hit KO. And if you look at like how the Garchomp damage calculation plays out, Garchomp hits you with a Life Orb boosted Earthquake, you go Defense Curl. It hits you with another one, you survive, and you Soft Boiled, and now you're actually gaining health every time you Soft Boiled. You Defense Curl again, Soft Boiled, Defense Curl. You still have 4 Soft Boileds. Garchomp's doing, I don't even know, a 5-hit KO at that point, and then you just win. Defense Curl is how you beat physical Pokemon on a Pokemon that is only meant to be dealing with special Pokemon because of how damage calculations work. But the garbage players in Smogon, and also just the rest of the competitive community, because no one's really catching on to the power of Defense Curl Blissey, but me and my audience, doesn't understand how Pokemon works. I'm the only person that does, apparently. It's crazy. And instead of admitting they were quadruple wrong, and this is what I mean, like, you can't have a rational conversation anywhere in Pokemon. You could prove these idiots wrong all day, and you can't get anything out of it to progress the community because they are too stubborn and ignorant to want to make things any better and actually accept the truth. Alternatively, you could use a super effective attack, which counters every single Pokemon. So why you're saying this specific strategy is bad, if you bring in the perfect, strongest Pokemon against it. Alright, fighting super effective Great Tusk into a Blissey or a Chansey. That is the worst possible matchup. Let me find the worst possible matchup for every Pokemon ever. That means all Pokemon are bad and every moveset is obviously satire. So yeah, if you're not paying attention to what's specifically going on but you're wondering why the Pokemon community is so terrible, this is why. The ignorance I've been calling out for a decade. The toxicity from Smogon, VGC, and the general Pokemon community that I've been calling out for a decade. The NPC behavior and all of the other nonsense that's been going on, just polluting Pokemon. So let's make this competitive Pokemon lecture complete with the classic evasion and OHKO logic that Smogon players cannot understand, and also just the misinformation and constant nonsense. So evasion boosting moves are banned in standard play. That is a complete lie because standard play is official Pokemon, not OU. There is no standard play to OU. And this is another big problem with Smogon. Also, like the constant lies from people in the Smogon community where they say, oh, this doesn't affect you. No, it affects the general Pokemon community because if you try to host a tournament without Smogon rules, you're getting in an argument with every Smogon player there. That's a guarantee. That's in their mentality and their philosophy. Also, Smogon players lie to new Pokemon players by telling them that Smogon is the only competitive format, and it used to be way worse back in the day where people thought that Smogon was the official competitive format, and that happened into Generation 7. And there's people that still think Smogon is the only official competitive format even now. We're like, wait, I thought that was banned. It's like, no, you can go into the Pokemon game, go onto the Battle Stadium, and use that Pokemon or move right now. And then also just like more lies and making stuff up. Evasion moves are banned in Smogon for being uncompetitive. Again, just arbitrary definitions, not backing anything up, and then not having an understanding of what uncompetitive means. And then as for Volcarona being banned, I think it's in similar vein to Dynamax. So yeah, Smogon players need an easier, more predictable game. But then we have to teach the Smogon players how the game works. There's nothing more uncompetitive to using evasion boosting than playing Scald or inaccurate moves for the better base power or effect. It's objectively inconsistent and contradictory to ban evasion boosting because of the claim that RNG elements are uncompetitive, but then allowing Scald to be in the metagame, even though it's a stronger RNG element that has more determination of the outcome of a game. 1 in 3 chance you burn the only opposing physical sweeper that threatens your team. That means, like, if you have a Blissey and then you're backing up with Scald or multiple Scalds or multiple ways of inflicting burn or other RNG elements, you just win the game. Or if an opponent goes for Swords Dance, you Scald them, 1 in 3 chance to burn. They just lost that turn, they took Scald damage, they're taking persistent burn damage, and it takes 2 more Swords Dance to get back to that first Swords Dance before the burn. And it's the same thing for running stronger moves that come at the cost of accuracy, like Hydro Pump, Focus Miss, or Stone Edge, and then there's also like Power Whip and Gunk Shot, and that's also why the Greninja ban never made any sense. So you have like a mixed Pokemon that's cutting its damage, that's also relying on RNG moves, and for some reason that makes it too strong, I don't know. I understand your point about the risk reward on moves like Scald and Focus Miss, and I doubt I can convince you to change your stance. So we can already see this is like just an impossibly ignorant brick wall of a person, but again, that's the exact Smogon philosophy. That is what these people are trained to do to defend the law of Smogon. There's no downside to clicking minimize, and that just proves it. Like, he's trying to change my stance with the completely false statement, there is no downside to clicking minimize. And it turns the game into who's luckier than who's the better player, even though, even with the current state of all the bans and stuff inside of Smogon, or at least when it came to like the metagame where Scald existed, the game was determined by luck to an outrageous extent, and it is still determined by luck to an outrageous extent in most Pokemon battles. Other move accuracies, random crits, the damage calculation formula itself, it's a futile effort to be like, yeah, RNG is uncompetitive, therefore we ban it, because there's way too many RNG elements in the game, because that is how Pokemon is designed. And we saw with Temtem that removing those RNG elements doesn't make a better competitive battle game. And then I tell him the same thing I told that other guy, to where the problem about banning everything is that it ruins the natural game balance, and then also cripples game sense. Strong counter to evasion is one-hit KO moves, since it bypasses accuracy bots. So yeah, like that's the thing, another thing about Smogon, is the reason why it's so unbalanced, is that it's just banning counters and then the natural balance to everything, to where it's like, okay, you banned something. Well, that was keeping 3 Pokemon in check. So you had to ban all 3 of those Pokemon. Well, now the power level has been lowered so greatly that a Pokemon that wasn't a threat becomes a threat, but it turns out this new threat that needs to be banned would have actually been a counter to the first Pokemon that was banned. So now we just, you're not doing anything. You are not creating any kind of balance by just arbitrarily knocking Pokemon that don't deserve to be banned down, and then not letting the metagame develop around it to begin with, because you're casual, unskilled players. Evasion is very uncommon, even in official Pokemon, because it's honestly just not that strong, especially now because it's been nerfed so much. Even 6v6 Battle Stadium singles doesn't see a spamming of evasion to win the game with Minimize. Also, Minimize is on a very restricted pool of Pokemon. Same thing with Double Team being removed as a TM. But even before that, in previous generations, even going back to like Generation 4, 5, or 6, it still wasn't everywhere on the official battle spot rules either. So if you can't OHKO that Pokemon in one turn, what happens? And then this guy just doesn't know how Pokemon works. He is, once again, just showing he understands nothing about Pokemon and just blindly follows the Smogon logic because Smogon players are better, therefore if I join Smogon, I'm better than everyone. And that's, again, the philosophy. If it can heal and you miss your next move, you're in trouble. Well, congratulations. You gave the opponent a free turn of setup. You gave the opponent potential multiple turns of setup because they had to posture themselves into that position to get a safe setup move, regardless of what it is. Iron Defense ends the game on the spot in a lot of situations. Calm Mind ends the game on the spot, especially with like stored power Pokemon. Evasion, Minimize, no different. Okay, cool. Iron Defense cuts damage in half. Minimize just makes it to where a turn might not happen for an opponent. And then again, much like how Smogon players are just completely wrong when they say like, oh, the rules don't affect you, or oh, we're just doing our own thing, their response to real competitive players just never makes any sense. If you want to play a format free from bans, I suggest anything goes. The existence of Anything Goes does not justify their terrible ban decisions for OU. One, because also restricted legendary Pokemon are in Anything Goes, so that means you're trying to say, like, oh, Evasion is on the same power level as Arceus, which is already just, like, not correct in any realm. And when you're allowing restricted legendaries and mythical Pokemon, then you don't have the competitive format that players are citing when it comes to the official rules. As for Oko, if you have to bring it or a 60 base power move, that's a real limit on team building. And then once again, just the broken Smogon mentality that, wait a second, this counters something I'm having a problem with. So that means we're going to have some kind of development in team building and eventually the meta. But no, instead of that, just ban everything that's a problem because I don't want to adapt. I'm not smart enough. I do not have the game sense to understand how to get around this problem. If you're losing to something, that's your fault, not what you're losing to. So yeah, if you can't Oko the Pokemon one turn, what happens? That means the Evasion player is fairly rewarded for getting themselves in a good game state. That's what I was talking about with like Iron Defense, Calm Mind, or any kind of setup Pokemon, that if Evasion was truly ban-worthy, it means you could be successful in any game state and just spam it whenever and win more games than you should. But no, it's not a free move, and that's another thing why I'm against Smogon bans in general, that there's no Pokemon you can just send out brainlessly and then win the game off of, or get an unfair amount of advantage in the battle because you just use that Pokemon. The broken Smogon logic really comes into full effect where you use the excuse, don't complain, just play with restricted legendaries and mythicals, so kind of like things I've already said. The limit on team building is forced restriction. So yeah, bans is what's limiting team building more than anything, and then also making the meta unstable and worse. Not the choice to bring a completely viable option to something that counters what your team is weak against. Yeah, like, Oko is viable. As we've learned from Pokemon Sword and Shield metagame, like Season 3, we're in the Oko meta, and that just carried straight into Generation 9, to where it's the fissure meta to me. But because Smogon players understand nothing about competitive Pokemon, they don't understand where it's like, yeah, it's not a limit to have to bring an Oko move because we're in a tank meta and potential, like, evasion meta if that was allowed, even though evasion meta has very rarely been a thing, if ever. Real competitive Pokemon battles have proven Oko moves are one of the biggest anchors to balance in the game. Balances against tanks, which have been, like, super problematic to where everyone's running multiple, 2 to 3 anti-tanks on a team, or even, like, 4 in their bring 6, pick 3. Like, it's outrageous. So, tanks are oppressive, Oko balances that, Smogon just destabilizes everything. There's never been an evasion meta, even like Generation 4, Generation 5. Still very low usage, just annoying when you get caught with your pants down and then someone stacks a minimize or even double teams on you. But then again, it's kind of going into the Pokemon that get it. So the Pokemon that get access to minimize are also going to be like tanky Pokemon and have like their own restrictions. So there's natural counters to that as well. And then, yeah, just everything is unbalanced because Smogon players don't understand how the game works. And then here, they think they're making a point. It comes back to the risk reward. Oko moves, 70% chance to miss, 30% chance to KO a Pokemon. Also, Oko moves are like countered by Focus Sash and stuff like that, so it puts more utility into how the game plays out. Any move after the opponent uses Minimize, 40% chance to miss, 60% chance to do what the move normally does. Making a 100% accurate move, 60% in a turn with little risk isn't skill, but luck. We already talked about it. There is risk because you can't just use it for free. So you have to do something to earn an advantage in the battle to then be rewarded for that effect, but also on a slower Pokemon. So if the opponent is running offensive, sweeping force, or has some kind of speed creep in, you're taking that hit for that setup, and then there's a greater than 50% chance that you get punished for doing that in a potential not effective game state. Also, where Oko moves exist, you can just keep using it on the minimized Pokemon, even if they're recovering, even if they're becoming invincible, and then they'll go away. So yeah, going back to minimized users are tank Pokemon, so they will take a hit first, and then they're trading health for setup. Like any other tank that can also win the game on the spot. Except it's actually worse for the evasion, because again, you can just get chumped by RNG. You go max evasions, and then they just hit through it twice, and you lose. Because you don't have the defensive utility to just survive it. Whereas if you get like the iron defenses up, only thing that takes you out is a crit. And even then, you can survive a crit into a sustained turn, and then you're fine. After the setup, the minimized Pokemon will be a low damage tank. That's another thing. Even if you're at max evasion, you're not turning around one-shotting or even two-shotting things. You're still slowly going to wear the opponent down and have the vulnerability through the RNG. If it wasn't skillful, you can use it at any time with any setup, which is false. Oko moves, hard counter minimize, and tank Pokemon. So you need them for balance, much like how you also need an item clause because that's what the game is balanced around. Verlisify always right. Maybe you should pick up the t-shirt because it's funny and just always seems to hold true. But because I'm always right, that makes me a threat to all these bad actors and idiots. And then Pokemon only gets worse. That's what I mean. Like, I want to have conversation. I want to break it down. I want to explain to these people where they are wrong. But then they just get deranged out of it. And it's sad and unfortunate for someone that loves Pokemon more than anyone else like me. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hope you all have a nice day. Thank you very much for watching.